Jeff Raderstrong is a seasoned ghostwriter and thought leadership coach. He has 15 years experience working with nonprofits and foundations to achieve large-scale social impact. Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I want to talk to you about your work in social impact and also your work related to writing. And uh,
hmm
to start, could you talk about you've been involved in a number of social impact book projects. How is writing for social impact different than writing fiction or other
hmm
genres?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question because I think, I think in some ways it's the same process, and I think in other ways it's quite different, right? And I've written a lot of social impact books, but I've also written, sort of typical business books as well. Worked with, business leaders who Um, I don't want to say that they don't have a social impact lens, but they are certainly more interested in sort of a single bottom line profit, right? So when working with a social impact client or someone who's wants to write about their social impact work, in the same way that it's more challenging to sort of get a double, triple bottom line return on an investment or work. I think you need to both make the business case for what you're talking about in terms of social impact, and in business case, I'm using that term broadly, while also making a more emotional appeal to the reader, or whoever's, engaging with the content. And um, it can be very challenging to try to understand with the author, the person that I work with, um, how much they want to go in one direction or another, right? So most of the people that I work with, while they're in social impact, they're also looking to do the things that everyone's doing with a book, which is raise their profile, build their brand, sell their services if they happen to be, a business, a social impact business. And so when I say make the business case, that's what I'm talking about. It's like those sort of standard things that, you don't write a book for it to sit in a corner, right? You want to get it out there. You want to sort of sell yourself. But then you also you have the author has this inclination or this drive to change the world, right? And but you can't change the world if you don't sell your idea, right? So how much do you want the idea to stand on its own legs? An idea for a different approach to selling that is more impactful, right? A different approach to hiring, right? That can be more focused on, underserved populations, for example. A different approach to thinking about, the law, right? There's a book I'm working on now that's a sort of a civil rights book. And that can be very altruistic, that can be very passion driven by the author. But then on the other hand, you need to, write a compelling story and sell a compelling product. And those aren't in contrast. I think in many ways they move together and they work together. But I find, and this is getting a little away from your question, but I think it relates. I find that people who are in the social impact space have a very hard time selling. They want the idea, they want the work to stand on its own. And um it just doesn't work like that, right? I mean, even someone like the first person who comes to mind is Brian Stevenson, with Just Mercy, right? I mean, it's a incredible book, incredible story, but he still sold it. He still had to work towards some business goals for his organization. Um, so that's kind of how the process is a little more nuanced and different when you're kind of outside the realm of a strictly business book and more in that social impact space.
Yeah, is part of the challenge identifying the audience or creating the audience? I mean, some of the words and phrases you were using was the notion that there are new or different ideas. It seems like it's kind of like creating a wave versus riding a wave, where
Yep.
social impact, is there some element of like you have to convince the audience that this is the thing they're looking for, whereas
Yeah.
other genres are like, oh, this is the existing audience, and um, you just have to put it in front of them, or how do you think about it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like a leadership book, just like, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People, right? Like everybody wants to do better, right? Everyone wants to improve their performance. Everyone wants to find those leadership hacks to make their workday better, right? And so and so those books can be very challenging because there's so many of them, right? And that is more of a conversation about how is the person going to leverage this for their own goals, right? Like speaking or, consulting, whatever. But yes, in terms of the social impact side, it is harder to find the lane, because there isn't that ready, there's no nonprofit book section in the bookstore, right? There's no, I mean, not that who goes to bookstores anymore. I do, I know you do. But it's not the same thing as it once was, right? There's no social impact section of the bookstore. There you might have an environmental, you might even have like a social justice you know, section. But that's just such a broad, I mean, that can be anything from a textbook to a memoir to whatever, right? To a book about, green energy, right? So it can be very challenging to find that market. Yeah.
So, how do you think about writing process, and what are some good strategies for new writers, particularly in the social
Mm.
impact space, to consider?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we can get in depth into the process as you want, and it's something that I certainly think a lot about and write a lot about and talk to people a lot, but all it comes down to is just writing. You just got to do it. I mean, it's not anything, fancy. And I think any writing teacher, coach, person giving advice would agree, right? I mean, like that's just, you just have to practice. You just have to grind it out. You just have to, get your stuff out there, get feedback. And I don't want to discount all the great books out there that are about how to write. But I think especially for social impact, and this goes back a ways in my career and sort of how we connected originally, back in the early days of the internet, 2010, let's say. I mean, it's funny to talk about that as a different time now, but it was where people were really engaged with other people's content online in a way that they just aren't now, and it's a shame. But when I started my career and started getting interested in this, blogging was such a great tool to do what I just described, right? You could throw something up online every single day. I mean, you can do that now, but people would connect with it in a way that is different, and I think engage with it and share it and sort of generate, you could respond to other people's stuff, and I think actually we see that coming back now a little bit with like newsletters. I think newsletters are kind of coming into vogue again, or at least increasing, because social media has really been a become gone on the downswing, with AI generated content, just like lack of moderation, all the, that's a whole nother discussion. But I do think we hopefully are getting back to a little bit, but um, and I hope that ecosystem can get people to just write more and connect more, and because some of it is about refining your ideas, especially in the social impact spaces we were just discussing. It's like you're trying to change the world, not to be too grandiose, but you're trying to change the world. And that's a really big, tall order. And so finding that community, finding your people who can help you refine those ideas, in addition to refining your ability to write, I think they go hand in hand because there is the medium is the message, right? Your ideas come out through the writing, and I think we can talk a little bit more about that idea, but like especially in the social impact, you can have that generative experience by just like not being too precious with your stuff, getting it out there, and connecting with people who are like-minded or not, hopefully not like-minded, and who you can grow, in your writing and your ideas.
Yeah, and some of what you're talking about also connects with another set of ideas I wanted to ask you about, which is the notion of cross-sector
Hmm.
collaboration,
Yep.
cross-sector thinking. and like how do we write for different sectors in the same way that we're trying to write for different
Yep.
audiences? You've done a lot of work with cross-sector collaboration in your
Yep.
nonprofit and foundation work. Why is cross-sector thinking, cross-sector collaboration
Yep.
important?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think like, the easy answer is like the challenges that we're confronted with these days are just so massive that you can't do it alone. I think that's always probably been true. But I think because of the way that we are so connected these days, that we're just the fact that we can have this conversation right now and the way that we're having it through the technology that we have is really beneficial, but it has also created a lot of spillover effects that are quite challenging, and it's hard to stay ahead of the curve. And if you don't have that big picture view, if you don't have a interdisciplinary cross sector, whatever you want to call it, point of view, then you're not going to be able to achieve sustainable change, right? And that's why I think social impact, particularly in business, which is again where I do a lot of my work, is so powerful because there's a scalability there, right? That most nonprofits can't have, and philanthropy really can't either unless they're sort of focused on that, explicitly on the seeding ideas to sort of bring to government, but again, that's a cross-sector collaboration. And I think unfortunately we've lost a little of that lately. I think because this is a total, generalization, but I do think you see with the way that we live our lives now that is so online and so digital, even if we are, connecting with people in person, we are really siloed. All of our media streams are so siloed, and I think that's made it harder to do what I was saying earlier about, the internet, the early days of the internet, or I should say the early days of social media, being able to connect with different people, get different perspective, get different ideas. Again, I hope that's coming back. I think, COVID obviously was an inflection point, but I do see I don't think it's a coincidence that as we've gotten more siloed in how we consume things and spending more time, on our devices, that we are fractured and less willing and able to see the bigger picture and think bigger and bolder about, you know, what's our moonshot for climate change? I mean, we just don't have it, right? Instead, we're sending billionaires into space. So, like different kind of moonshot, I guess.
Yeah. Well, some 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 of what you just said really resonated with me, and it was associated with scale, and I think that's
Yeah,
something that's lost sometimes on. I know I didn't really understand it well when I first started in the nonprofit arena, where I
totally.
wasn't thinking at the right scale at the right time, and I wonder if that's part of the benefit of cross-sector thinking is understanding
Yeah,
the scale of different interventions or
yep,
programs or policies, and understanding
yep,
what's needed when and at what scale, and what is you also mentioned like the sustainability of whether it's a business or a program or a
yep.
policy. Do you see that as a kind of characteristic of uh, cross-sector thinking, that you're able to
Yeah.
understand better the scale for like what kind of right sizing programs and that kind of
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because like think, to be a little reductive, right? My first real job was at a community health center, right, in DC. Um, and they could grow their program. I mean, they could grow, right? They could scale in the traditional sense. They could serve more people, but the inputs, it would be basically a one-to-one input, right? Like, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, like that is in terms of the most impact I've had in my work, that might be the most direct impact I've ever had in my career was working at that community health center, right? Because we were literally seeing people who might have died, right, if that didn't exist in that community, right? Or gone hungry or, whatever it is, right? And I think about that work a lot, even though it was a relatively short moment in my career. But what I and this gets to writing too, it's like my first thing I did for them was not the first thing, but the first major thing I did was wrote an op-ed for in support of the Affordable Care Act. This was back when that was, you know, and so that was an influence play, right? And so they were this, they weren't small. I mean, they were serving hundreds and hundreds of people every day, but so then we got it in the Washington Post. I still have it. It's behind me right now. I cut, I bought the paper, right? Like you used to do and cut it out. And again, I still get a paper, but I'm unique in that way. And did that make Obamacare happen? No, of course not. But it was a part of a cohesive strategy of organizing by nonprofits to influence government to get this. Obamacare is probably the most significant expansion of the social safety net in our lifetime. I mean, hopefully not. Hopefully we get a broader expansion, but so far, right, it is. And so nonprofits were able to influence government in that way. And of course, they didn't get everything they wanted, blah blah blah. All those caveats, but that is that cross-sector engagement and that scale. I think similarly, right, you look at foundations and what they're able to do with whether you agree with it or not, the charter school movement, right? I mean, those charter schools have been funded and seeded and expanded through philanthropies, right? And that has a model that's maybe less one-to-one. I don't know. I mean, obviously you need people to be in the schools, but they are able to get revenue sources, right, from districts and things like that. So yeah, whether or not you agree with charter schools, right, philanthropy was able to scale that type of education solution, right? Um, and I think you could see, I mean, there's so many examples of that, right? And I think with business, right, like a lot of people think of scale as only the domain of business, and it's clearly not, right? We've just said, but business partnerships and business, if there is a model um, that can be, scaled through a profit, I mean, of course you would want to do that, right? And I mean, I think like the clearest example is like green energy and, all the expansion of that over the last 5 to 10 years, which of course was driven by government investment, right? Um, but what I will say is I think, back to the writing and the creating of content, right? You can think about ideas. The way for nonprofits and philanthropy to scale their work, I do believe, is through sharing insights, right? If the community health center has a great intervention, you want to get that out there, right? You want to, and I mean, you can go talk about it. You can, you have meetings and those are all important, but like, I mean, white papers get a bad rap, but like, people can use them, people do can I have had many experiences throughout my career where, a piece of writing influenced change somewhere else, right? And that's always true. Um, and I think that moving forward, that will just become more important, right? As I said, as we get more siloed, like we need more of that, cross-sector stuff or cross-pollination, cross-engagement.
Yeah. Well, so coming back to the writing, I want to ask you about you've mentioned a few different kind of types of artifacts. You mentioned white papers, you mentioned
Yep.
your Washington Post article, you mentioned
Yep.
blogs, and of course, books. How do you think about the ecosystem right now of kind of the artifacts that can be put out? What
Hmm.
has more influence? What makes sense for different applications? How do you think about those different, type
Yeah.
of writing formats, I guess?
Yeah, it's so hard. It's so hard because, like I said, I think social media is your return on investment. And again, using that term broadly for social media is basically nothing. I mean, there's no return on investment. It's so hard to get any engagement. So much of it is AI generated now. I do think whatever content gets you, oh yeah, I'll put it this way, whatever content gets you real engagement, and I don't mean that in like the social media way, and like you and I now are engaging, right? Like real connection, um, is what's gonna get you to where you want to go, right? So I've been pushing my clients to start newsletters for a really long time, like really even before um even before all this stuff happened with, Twitter and Facebook and all this AI stuff. Because you're in control of it, you're disseminating it to people who want it, and you're hearing, ideally, right, you're hearing back from them, right? You have that two-way street with, something as basic as like more people subscribe, right? Like if you're putting out, if people are buying what you're selling, right, they want to subscribe to it. But that you can also, especially with like a Substack now, like you can also get engagement back for people. People will email you back, right? Like a very simple, right? It's going back to that sort of two-way communication, but a mass distribution. So, I think, but that's hard because you need to build that up. And how do you do that? Well, you can't really use social media anymore because it's such a, so there are certainly challenges. But what I'll say, I'll also just put in I've always thought books, are the way to do it, right? Like if you can put out a book, right, and you can leverage it effectively, and we can talk about what that looks like. Um, I mean, that's just the best tool for engaging someone because you're offering them 200, 300 pages of your thoughts, right? Of how you think the world should be. Um, and for someone to sit down and read that, even if they just read a couple chapters or whatever, right? I mean, that is really powerful, right? And you can do a lot with that. Including, use some of that content for a newsletter or whatever, or even social media, right? So I think the more integrity you bring to it, the more detail, the more nuance that a piece of content has, the better. You can obviously do that on social media, especially, a LinkedIn post, a LinkedIn article, but it's very hard to do, you know.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned books. I want to ask you about the book publishing industry and
Yeah,
how it's changing right now.
yeah.
There's I've become more familiar with this in talking to you, but how do you think about that right now? What does it look like, and
Hmm.
where do you think it's going?
Totally, yeah. And I mean, I'm no publishing expert. I came to this through, by working with people who want to get their books published. So I had to learn a lot too. But I mean, there's just so many books. There's so many options. There's so many paths to publishing now. Which like social media, like there's just more content, which makes it easier to get into, but also harder to stand out, right? So it's very hard to get a big five, which the big five publishers are like what you think of when you think of publishing, right? Like the New York publishers, like Random House, like all those other guys. And there are self-publishing is super easy and it's super great. And I've worked with a lot of people who've self-published and really, really done very well and like help them achieve what they wanted to achieve. And then there's this middle ground of hybrid publishing where you kind of share the costs a little bit. You get some benefits from doing that. You don't have to do all the work yourself. So it's basically in between self-publishing and traditional publishing. And then within that, there's so many differences, right? And there's so many different types of hybrid publishing. Within even traditional publishing, you can go to like the academic press or a small press or, so there's a lot there. But again, it's all about what do you want to achieve? What do you want to do? What do you want to sell? Again, using that term broadly. Um, and what do you want people to do with the book? And so I actually work a lot with a lot of my clients. I help them sort of navigate that. I'm not an agent, but I've certainly secured book deals for people, because it's all kind of just like I said with writing, you just got to do it. You got to figure it out. You got to grind it out. And because there's a broader, aperture of what's possible, a lot more opportunities in. It's just then what do you do about it? How do you get to that next level?
Yeah. So you've spoken to this a little bit already, but I'm maybe this is a more philosophical question. What
Yeah.
do you think is the role of books and writing in society or in cross-sector social change efforts generally?
Yeah, I think that's very philosophical. What do I think? So I would say, I think that the work of social impact at scale is essentially about ideas, right? I don't think you have social change, broadly speaking, if you don't have um, new ideas, good ideas, different ideas. I mean, it's like kind of it's in the title, right? Social change, social impact, right? Um, and so things do have to change. And I do think books are a very useful tool to share ideas, you know, and share ideas in a way that is concrete and it's, they can be big and bold, but they're very contained, right? You can hold them in your hand. And I think that, I mean, I know a lot of people read, I have a Kindle like a lot of people, right? But it's like it's there. It begins and it ends, right? And you have a finite amount of engagement with it, which I think is what we are lacking with social media, right? It just always continues, so you never know where it ends and you never know what to do about it, right? I think
Mm.
the same is true with like an op-ed or, something. It's 1,000 words and that's all it is, right? And you can put it away and think about it on your own, right? I think with the book, you read a chapter, you read the whole thing, you say, oh, okay, interesting. Um, and so certainly that's not like a book isn't gonna do stuff on its own, but I think if you want to, again, drive things forward, drive ideas forward, you need to have a place to hold those ideas, right? I think you can look at this over time, right? I mean, um, a good Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? Is like Lincoln said that was the book that started the Civil War, right? I mentioned Bryan Stevenson. A lot of people, cast, even Kendi's work. Like those books have compelled a lot of things forward in terms of racial justice and criminal justice reform in the case of those books. But I think that um, it's never outside of what's also going on. I mean, like all those people that I mentioned were doing work, also doing work, but they were able to, share those ideas and again, bring that to the next level. I think the book that I always cite when talking about this is Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, which talks about basically a multiracial, multiracial prosperity and why we don't have that, right? And that came out during COVID or maybe right before, and I don't think it got as much play as it should have, but I think it speaks to what our future could look like, right? And she's not the only one writing about it. There's a lot of people writing about that, but you know, I think without books, without that collection of thoughts and ideas and visions for the future, we don't have the future. We don't have a better future.
Mm. Well, so on the note of future or potential futures, what do you see as the future of writing for social impact?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I think my hope is that we would have more of what you and I had, when we started out our careers in 2009, 2010, whenever that was, of that, real collaboration and sharing of ideas and real engagement. I think that's really lacking. I think that's missing. I think we need more of those communities. And I'm not trying to say they don't exist. I think they do. Absolutely. I think, a lot of there's all kinds of Facebook groups and groups out there and conferences and so. But again, I think we don't have that level of um, rigor. I'll just call it rigor that we once did. I think just because of the ecosystem, the media ecosystem that we're in.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time to
Hmm.
talk about ideas and share insight. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was great. Always great.